about various aspects of interoperability. So I'll go through quickly. I'm happy to take questions as I go, but if they're not urgent, maybe we can save the question for the end, and then we'll get into question and answer mode after that. After question and answer, there will be just a few minutes at the end of the meeting for some business items, but most of it will be the dialogue. So when we're talking about data and data management, data curation, etc., for the Arctic and for the polar regions, there's been a lot happening over the last decade, particularly coming through the International Polar Year and since then, given the importance of the polar regions and the Arctic in particular, in terms of environmental terms, in social terms, in geopolitical terms, etc. So this screen just gives you a sense that there's much happened just on the data side of that as well. We've had a number of different workshops. Data management workshop happened in 2010, and there have been several since then. We've had 2 polar data forums, so meetings that were focused entirely on polar data management. The second one happened about a year ago now, and had, I think, close to 110 participants we had at that one. And we now have other organizations, such as the Open Geospatial Consortium, has just launched a Arctic Spatial Data Pilot Project. So a lot happening in those conversations, and there's a lot going on in terms of trying to identify what our needs are, what our possibilities are. As part of that, if you analyze the results of those reports, of those workshops and those fora, interoperability comes up again and again as a priority. So on the screen here, I've put one sort of definition, high-level definition that was in the second Polar Data Forum communique. And I think when I'm working with science communities, when I work with indigenous communities, which is a lot of what I do, we may not use the term interoperability. We may use things like, information exchange, knowledge exchange, data transfer, sharing, and that sort of thing. But ultimately, when we're talking about digital systems, computer-based systems, digital data, we're often talking about this idea of interoperability, ability for these systems to share data across. And when I say share, I make a distinction between share and exchange. Simple exchange means I can move my data over to your system. I can download it. When I talk about sharing, I think about the idea that to be able to truly share, the recipient needs to be able to understand the data and use the data. So this is something that I think takes us beyond the simple capacity of the internet to move bits and bytes around to actual interoperability, which means I can actually take your data, and your data and use it in my scientific endeavors or my community endeavors. This conversation is happening in the context of an international meeting that is coming up the 8th and 9th of November. It'll be in Frascati, Italy at the European Space Agency headquarters at Esrin. What we're doing there is we're trying to look at from a circumpolar, well actually both poles, it will be Arctic and Antarctic, looking at the idea of interoperability and how we can make some progress in terms of achieving interoperability. There are a number of deliverables, and it's actually just a workshop. It's a process, and I think that's important because we're not looking to just say, what are the ideas of the people who happen to be at the meeting for those 2 days, but we want to get broad input from the community over several months. So to start with, the meeting has the opportunity to provide to a survey to give some just basic information about your thoughts and interests. We're then having the workshop, and there will then be an actual writing process. There are going to be theme leads who will be working on a report that we're going to submit to IASC, SAON, SCAR, and I think at this moment we have about, I think it was in my last slide, there are about 12 organizations. You can't unfortunately see them all on this slide, but I can point you to the website at the end of the talk. We have about 12 organizations who are sponsoring this. We have a number of different themes that we're looking at, and I'm just going to go through quickly in a few slides here. But everything from metadata right through to governance and how we actually sustain the systems over time. So data discovery and the idea of metadata and how we document the data is critically important. If we can't find it, we can't interoperate. And there's an interoperability component to the metadata aspect of the systems. We need to be able to ensure the catalogs can speak to each other, that they can exchange metadata, as well as sharing in different languages, trying to figure out how we move that sort of descriptive data around. We also talk a lot about data as a service. So once I've discovered data, I've identified maybe 3 or 4 data resources. The typical sort of historical approach to that would be I would download the data, I'd do some work on it, reproject it, subset it, whatever, and then in a few days or a few weeks or a few months' time, I would be able to start actually doing my analysis or doing the work on it. With the data as a service model, the idea is that these data sets are available sort of online as a live feed that allows you to connect to the data in real time. And be able to start to use it in a very short period of time. There's also a lot of work going on in how we use different kinds of data. Typically, in the Arctic, there's been a lot of dominance of the physical sciences for good reasons, atmospheric, active layer permafrost, oceans, etc. But there's also a lot happening in terms of the social sciences of the Arctic, as well as indigenous knowledge and community-based observing. And those bring to the table a unique set, or at least a different set of issues and possibilities in terms of the interoperability. And some of those are technical and some of them are more political, if you will, or the idea, for example, of indigenous data sovereignty and how that movement's sort of moving forward. Something that's coming along, I think, very quickly, and I don't know if Peter Griffith is on the phone, but he's a very active participant in this group. He's with the NASA Above program, and they have launched, for example, the NASA's Above Science Cloud. The idea there, as he points out, is to take the code to the data rather than the data to the code. This is not probably so important if you're thinking about a few rows or columns of data, but when you're dealing with massive data sets of remote sensing, hyperspectral imaging, all those types of things that we now have, it becomes very important in terms of functionality and the ability to use the data. The question is, when we start moving into a cloud data or a computing platform, and some people, Europeans, tend to talk about it more as a virtual research environment, what does that mean in terms of what our requirements for interoperability are, but also what are the possibilities, what kind of interfaces are being attached to these clouds so that the data and results, models, et cetera, can be shared outside the environment. And then there are the higher level issues that are no less important. So when you're talking about standardization, for example, we should all be using ISO 19115 to share metadata. We should all be using an OGC web feature service or an OpenDAP data feed. Who gets to decide that? How do we ensure that people are adhering to the standards appropriately? How do we plan out the resourcing? Do we prioritize and say, well, at a national level, this is our budget to enable these types of interoperable services, and this scientific domain is probably a higher priority in the short term than that scientific domain, et cetera. And also the sustainability. There are many, many different projects I've been involved in where some great advancement has been made in setting up, web services, for example, or making things interoperable, but it's on a 2 or 3 year research cycle. And within a year or two after the funding is gone, the services disappear as well, and then the model breaks. So we have to figure out, okay, if we're going to move down this road, how do we stop seeing this as sort of one-off or ad hoc type development, and how do we start seeing it as infrastructure? And in the same way as we have other kinds of infrastructure in our world, and we have to maintain it, we'll have to do so for this data and information infrastructure. So those are really some big and important conversations that are starting to happen and I think need to happen moving forward. Another issue or possibility and challenge that comes up is how do we connect what we're doing in the polar regions to broader global initiatives? There's often the question of, should we be working with the polar regions as a focus, or should we just be considered as part of the global system with respect to data systems? So there are a number of large global systems. Geo is an example. The Group on Earth Observations has their GEOS platform. The WMO has many different platforms that have been developed. The Research Data Alliance, although they're not as much infrastructure or systems hosting, it's become a global forum of over 4,000 members to talk about issues related to data, data management, interoperability, et cetera. So how do we ensure that as a community we're engaging with this larger global system, and at what point sometimes is it actually better to just see ourselves as a member of the global community rather than our own polar community or regionally defined community. So these are the things that we're looking at talking about at the workshop in Frascati next month. But these conversations are also happening at a national level, and they've certainly been happening here in this forum in IARPC at the data coordination team, as well as a number of.
Great. Peter, that was great. I enjoyed that very much. I don't know, that first bullet that you have, what is the interoperability from the perspective of different stakeholders? I think that is a very, very good question, and one that needs to be discussed by this new WMO Pan-Arctic Polar Regional Climate Center initiative. I don't know if you've had any dialogue with Hernan Garcia, who's with NESDIS and CEI, but he will be attending a technical WMO meeting next month, the week of the 7th, I think it is, to discuss the data aspect. So I would certainly encourage you to reach out to Hernan in advance of the PRCC technical meeting and perhaps bring some of these guiding questions to attention, because I think these need to be addressed at the PRCC meeting. That's one aspect.
Great.
The second aspect is, as you probably know, WMO is about to embark on a major 2-year core field campaign for the year of polar prediction. And the last meeting that I attended the first week in September in Reading, UK, the whole issue of data management came up. And I think there's a great deal of, how do we do this? Who do we do it with? How is the data going to best be served? Where does it go? Yada, yada, yada. So I don't know if you've had any discussion with Thomas Young, who is the chair of the Polar Prediction Project, but I would certainly encourage you to reach out to Thomas, and I can help facilitate that if needed, to bring the two of you together, because I think this would be something that I think he'd appreciate talking with you about. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Renee. So I have been in contact with Hernan, and I actually met with him last month in Denver at the RDA meeting and the International Data Week. So he's engaged in the conversation. YOP is actually one of the sponsors of this workshop. I assume you're speaking with the Year of Polar Prediction. And Oystein Godoy, who is the data lead, or one of the data leads on that initiative, is one of the lead editors on this reporting process. But if you could make any and all connections that we can, that would be great, because we want to really have this conversation at a global level to ensure that we're not creating sort of national silos. So thank you very much for that.
Great, glad to hear it.
Okay, any other thoughts? And I'll put out what I often do at conferences and say, for the first 3 people who speak up, I'll buy you a beer when I next see you. I can't make promises.
Awesome, Peter. I'll take you up on that. This is Melissa Zoing from NCI. So we're kind of the long tail of data stewardship here. You know, we're looking 75 years forward, and that's how we're doing our data management. So we're being asked to increase interoperability, and I think we have, at least on a conceptual level, a decent idea of what we need to do. So we have standard formats and templates and apps that can use things. But we're being asked to do most of this at zero cost.
Mm-hmm.
So with fewer resources, we wind up kicking a lot of this work back to the scientists and the PIs and the data originators. How do we ensure that scientists are engaged in making their data interoperable from the very beginning, and how can we help them out?
Great. That's a great point, and it's something I talk about regularly as well, about the cost of not doing it from the start. So we have documentation that indicates that the cost of doing data management, after the fact or later in the process is much higher. So if we can do it early on, it's going to be beneficial, but at the same time, most of the PIs that I work with and others, they either don't have the time in their awards or in their projects, or they don't have the expertise to do that. And I'm seeing that change, but I'd be interested in hearing anybody else who has some thoughts on this as well, as how do we sort of move forward on that so it's not just seen as the job of the data managers to sort this out, but it's more of a community-owned initiative, if you will.
Yeah, I've noticed that some of
Yeah, and I do note, I'm an NSF researcher, and I can now put in a reasonable amount of funding for data management. It's still probably not enough for a full-time person, but it's at least, we're making progress on recognizing that this is a valuable part of research. But there are other contexts as well. There are agency contexts, community contexts, et cetera. Just a question from your perspective, you're being asked to do it at zero cost. Are you finding that in terms of the systems development as well as, getting the data sets ready and the web services or things like that, do you just then build that into your annual budgets and do it incrementally, or are there other ways that you're trying to pull in specific funding to sort of leapfrog ahead to get these systems in place?
federal government scale initiatives to do interoperability for all different kinds of data. And so at least in my work in the Arctic, I'm able to piggyback a little bit off of what these other projects are doing. So it's been advantageous that the entire federal government has this as a focus now.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, any other thoughts, comments, or questions?
Peter, this is Julia. Just to follow up on the question that I think it was Melissa just posed. So it seems like we have pretty strong funding on a project-by-project basis, and I would be interested in hearing any discussion outcomes at the upcoming workshops about how we transfer that, what we learn in each project, to a larger infrastructure for others to learn from. I think that's kind of where we're dropping, and we may never get the funding we want to make a really long-term sustainable Arctic data center in the way we might think of it, but there has to be some way of ensuring that we're rewarding those individual funded projects for gains they've made in how they're doing interoperability, bringing that back to the larger community. Don't have a good answer for that, but that seems to be the wall that I frequently run into, is it's just once you're outside of a specific project, then you hit a wall of what you can do.
Great, thank you for that. That brings up another question that I'd like to put out there as well, is this idea of, you know, a sort of an Arctic data center. And given the breadth and depth of research, you know, taking place in and around the Arctic, you know, is that something we are aiming for? Is that something that's achievable, not only achievable, but is it something that we would really strive for? Or should we be thinking about, you know, a set of data centers that are interoperable? Because that regularly comes up in conversations I find with within the science domain.
It seems to me a set of data centers might be easier to actually make a reality than one big overarching data center. At least that's a model I think would be interesting to try to work towards. We have a little bit of that with what used to be ACADIS and now is, I'm forgetting the name. So there's some of those, yeah, so there's some of these individual initiatives that maybe we can start leveraging them.
Thanks. I note there's a comment in the chat window from Gay Peng, which is, I often find that it's helpful to provide consistent guidance in the language that scientists can relate to, how to coordinate efforts to provide a consistent guidance to scientists. So I think that's actually a critical point as well around what Melissa talked about, which is getting it started right from the very beginning, as the education, training, and support materials to help people along in that as they try to do this. Okay, other thoughts?
Okay, I'll make one more comment. This is Julie again. So on this concept of getting the data management in from the get-go on some of the research projects, it might also be interesting to consider building off of the data carpentry or software carpentry movements and tackling this at the graduate school level, trying to address it from a curriculum point of view and getting some projects going that actually work with graduate students to build their habits for data management and sort of build it from the ground up there.
Thank you. Good point. I know CoData is doing some work on that internationally, and we could probably make some connections there. Okay, any others? I see a few people on the line who could probably talk a little bit about some of the things that they've developed and maybe, you know, the contributions that's making, or some of the challenges that they've had along the way in developing interoperable systems. So any thoughts on that?
Hi, I'll jump in here. This is Bill Manley with University of Colorado. I guess I'm too late for a beer, though.
I don't think so.
But I'll buy one for you, Peter.
You always get a beer, Bill.
All right, great. Well, you know, echoing a little bit the discussion so far about costs, and I think overall benefits of interoperability, you know, there's two things we can look at. One is that, yeah, when there's sharing of information or data between, say, portals or data centers, if we can be a little proactive, then we can avoid a great deal of laborious reharmonizing and reprocessing of information. But the other way, I think that it can, if we coordinate some, that we can avoid a lot of effort or expenses, is just so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. So there's a couple of things that come to mind.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill.
Peter, I'm hoping I can ask Bill for a follow-up. This is Lynn.
Sure.
Hey, so we talk a lot about you know, don't reinvent the wheel and reuse and things like that, but I wonder if that's actually catching on in practice in terms of actual reuse of technologies. Are you seeing a lot of pickup of existing code, or do you think there's still work to do there? What's your view at this point?
Well, I think I guess what I was thinking about in terms of not reinventing the wheel is if groups could package what they have learned in perhaps educational materials so that it's not so much sharing code as sharing a foundation for, okay, if you're going to go to ISO, well, there's lots of different ways to go. This is one way to go. Or maybe what it comes down to is not so much what a specific metadata standard or dialect, if you will, you use, but instead let's have some attention early on to making sure that the actual fields or metadata elements that we're going to share are going to be compatible across systems rather than having to repopulate, backfill records, if you follow me.
Thanks. I think I misunderstood you the first time, but that makes a lot more sense, and I like that too.
Cool.
Hi, this is Rob from the Alaska Ocean Observing System. Are you guys hearing me?
Rob? Yeah, great. Thanks for coming out. And what can you share?
Yeah, we've been kind of involved on the periphery with NSF-style projects, but we're heavily involved in a lot of ocean and atmosphere integrated ecosystem research program support in the Arctic. Things like the MARES study, funded by BOEM, Arctic EIS, North Slope Burrow, Northwest Arctic Burrow science programs, and there's a lot of things that were discussed on this call today, and several of these is, the development of tools, convergence upon these tools, also integrating data management into the initialization of the scientific projects. I just want to echo a lot of these things that are being stated right here is that we've learned kind of the hard way that that is the correct way to do data management. Also, I think that one of the problems is that data management has occurred in isolation between data managers and individual researchers. So researchers will work with like a data manager over email and transfer files and like work on a metadata file, and then they'll go to like a NCEI ascension process or submit data to Data 1. And one of the problems is there's just not really transparency among the scientific community in terms of, hey, how are other groups managing their data? And can I look at examples of like my colleague who's in the same domain, how are they managing their data? What formats are they converging upon? And what are their best practices in terms of metadata generation? I think that one of the problems is that these standards we assume are really like locked in stone, but you can meet the data and format standards and be still fairly heterogeneous. And so we've been using a tool called the Research Workspace, which we initially believed we could build this piece of technology, propagate it to the scientific community, and they would just get it. And they would just kind of engage using this, web-based forms to generate metadata and such. But in reality, what we discovered is that the scientific community, even though they're being charged with performing data management activities, or they included in the proposal, they really lack the guidance and the tools. And so you do need those data managers and data curators who have the best practices in mind and can work with the researchers and the research community. So I hope I'm not trying to muddy the conversation here, but I think increasing transparency among the scientific community so that it looks as if they're working together to implement data management and they're not working in isolation is really, really important. And also people begin to look at other groups and it's kind of a competition. They're like, oh, look at this other group, look what they've done with their core sampling data or their ADCPs or their weather station data and how they describe it. Well, I want to at least do as good as that. And I think what's happening a lot of times is people are so focused on their individual studies, and when data management comes around, they're just working with a data manager in isolation. and they don't really understand the full breadth and possibilities and examples that are out there existing. It's hard to kind of integrate that in unless it's part of the scientific workflow.
That's great, Rob. I think those are all excellent points, and particularly the last part about the sort of getting the communication flowing across, different projects, but also in different disciplines. And I know in the NSF world I work in, there's now a mechanism or a research coordination network, and so I'm involved in a couple of those. And it's really becoming quite transformative because the resources are dedicated to getting people together, to sharing, to forming new partnerships and that sort of thing. I see a lot of efficiency, and the interoperability is sort of following because people are thinking about sharing. So those are all great points. Thank you for that. All right. Do we have others that people want to add or build on what Rob and others have said, or some new comments or questions?
Well, this is Bill Manley again. I'll jump in and say one thing is, this forum, data committee, the collaboration team, it is a particularly unique and promising venue, I think. But one thing that's become apparent, I think, is wow, the subject of data interoperability or metadata interoperability is so different within the federal realm versus within academia and NSF-sponsored research. And unfortunately, I think given more of a bottom-up rather than top-down approach in academia, there are additional challenges that we'll have to overcome.
I think that's an excellent point. And I've now had exposure just through my own career. I have exposure to the NSF world, and then recently more with IARPC, and I'm starting to get a better understanding of agency issues and approaches. So that's something we, I think, definitely need to add to this record. I'm pleased that IARPC exists for that reason, and this is why I've become engaged, actually, because NSF is one of the agencies that's a member of IARPC. So I think it has a good possibility of really starting to make some bridges there. But I think, yeah, my is along those lines, and I know there's a really good example now where we're starting to see some connections between NCEI and the NSF Arctic Data Center, and so I'm not sure, Melissa, if you could say a few words about that. But are there other examples of that as well, where we're making connections, successful connections between academia and agencies?
I guess I can speak a little bit about that. This is Melissa again. So the idea is for Data One and NCEI to sort of become coupled at the end of the day. So we would be the long tail for the data stewardship of what's coming through their network. And Shaquila's not on the call, so Shaquila is the Data One project manager for NCEI, and so she's the one with all the details, but yeah, we're working on it.
I'm wondering maybe Rob or Molly as well. I suspect that you have this intersection as well between agency work and then also working with funded research projects under NSF or similar. Are you seeing some good possibilities, or are there things that you've learned in trying to work in both of those domains? I'm not sure if Rob or Molly heard that, but.
Peter, it looks like Molly is typing. Perhaps she doesn't have audio.
Okay. Yeah, great. Okay. Well, something maybe to think about, and it'd be great. We're going to be taking any feedback we can after this call as well, and as I said, through next month as well. But I think that's something we'll definitely include, is this idea that there are different contexts that we're working in that we need to consider. Any other thoughts or comments? You know, answers or thoughts on some of the questions on the screen, or some that you have of your own?
Can you hear me now, Peter?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Rob had to get off, but yeah, as Alaska Ocean Observing System is part of the National Integrated Ocean Observing System, so we do have standards that we have to meet that are developed and ratified by the Interagency Ocean Observing Committee, which is a multi-agency group. So we work closely with different federal agencies on their standards, on their how to get access to their data, how to provide it in simpler formats. And then we work a lot with private sector data as well. So we just received all the shell data that they've collected over the last decade in the Chukchi Sea. We're starting to get all of ConocoPhillips data. And again, we work with them so that that data is in standards and can be archived at the National Archives as well. So we've been kind of bridging that gap between private sector and agency and academic researchers.
Okay, so we do have some examples where it can be done, and obviously there are probably some things you've had to do to make that work, but maybe that's something we can build on in terms of documenting those challenges and also some of the ways of addressing them.
Yeah, and we just put together, we just applied for certification through the NOAA process for all of the IUS regional associations. And a major part of that is that all of your data has to be QA/QC'd, it has to have certain standards, and we have all of that documented. I'd be happy to share it with anyone.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, any other thoughts or comments?
Peter, this is Allison Gaylord calling from Alaska as well, and actually I wanted to point out what I think is a success story among the Alaska Data Integration Work Group in establishing data concepts about projects, and this is something Molly's group and many of the agencies up here have been involved in. So as a result, we've been able to integrate information from a number of federal and state entities about just basic discovery level information about where people are working. And I think that was quite a success, actually. And that information is now available in an ISO-based standard as well, but could be mapped over to other metadata standards. And then through my own work with the Arctic Research Mapping application, we've integrated a lot of information using the ADIWIG standard. Another related NSF project, we're trying to push that to the discovery level for where people are actually doing their work, where they're sampling in the field. And I think that process is catching on so that we can start to exchange information via web services in that way as well. But where I think it's really breaking down, at least in our distributed model, is in connecting with the data centers on, where are the data sets stored for this instrument. And there's a lot of manual resyncing and data wrangling happening at that level. And that's where I think there needs to be some more work or buy-in, perhaps, from where the data is being archived. And so we've had this vision of metadata or data and project life cycle. So from once the project is funded, there's a discovery level metadata record out there. Once people go into the field, we find out where they're working, where their towers, their boreholes, whatever are, capture that information. But then it starts to break down when we try to connect with, okay, where did the data end up after 3 years or 4 or 5 years and they've completed their state?
Okay, thanks for
Hi,
that.
this is Sean Helfand calling in.
Great. Hi, Sean. Go
Hi,
ahead.
Alison. This is Melissa. I was really interested to hear that. So if you want to contact me offline, I can try to help you. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to help you, but I'd like to try.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to carry the conversation on.
Great. I know, Sean, you mentioned that you joined. Is there anything that you wanted to comment on, or were you just announcing?
Just announcing, so I'm just coming in that, so I didn't get a chance to be able to hear anything because I had another 2 meetings that had taken up the last 40 minutes. But if there's anything that some of the other topics that we've talked about, I guess it was earlier this week even, for the NCEI meeting, we could certainly discuss a little bit more about that. I have still the same actions I need to address that were requested last meeting.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, we've certainly heard Melissa's been updating us a bit on the NCI side of things, as well as we have some other connections through AUs and elsewhere. So I think that's definitely a sort of a system that we need to be thinking about in terms of not only how it's making data available and interoperable, but also how others can connect to it in the other direction. I just want to touch as well, just building on what you were talking about, Allison, in terms of the ADWIG work. Something else I found really interesting and important in that work is thinking about what practitioners need to really be able to move forward in their work. And one of the things that that group has done is it's taken the ISO standard and it's made a JSON. And I won't go into all the details of that, but that's a particular format that can be readily used within web applications. And to me, that's a really big step, because I've regularly when you're working with a developer and they're saying, okay, well, you're giving me XML, but I really need JSON. I need this different sort of representation. It's either something that can really shut down the project, or it can just be a huge cost to have to sort of mediate across those things. So having this resource out there and freely available, I think allows us to not get work done. But when I think about having to hire resources, bringing somebody on who has the skill set to work with JSON is a bit easier to do these days than getting somebody who can expertly manipulate the XML version of ISO. So I think that's important to note, as well as what do people down in the trenches really need to get their work done.
Actually, this is Sean. Could you repeat that a little bit more about the JSON? So in some of the data that we've been getting in from the Alaska Weather Service office, they had to convert their web services to JSON files. And one of the things that at least we ran into as an issue was our current ArcGIS 10.1 does not have JSON as an option, but 10.3 or 10.2 and higher have that as an export option, as well as a read option. It sounds like there's some sort of data converter that is available. Maybe you could just touch very briefly as to who has it and what its capability is.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sure, and there are a couple things, and I think Allison may need to follow on to my comments. But with respect to data, there are a number of tools out there. I use one called OGR, and that would, if you have geographic data in a particular XML format or whatever, it can change it to a Geo JSON. But what I was referring to is actually the metadata, and so there's a metadata standard, ISO 19115, and most of the materials, services, code written around it historically has been in XML. And what the ADWIG group has done is that they've made all of that available in JSON, so that if you have a developer who needs to wrap metadata around data, they're not having to translate everything. And they're still working on that, but they've done a really good job to the point that, you can sort of use it or increasingly use it out of the box. And so I don't know, Allison or Bill, if you have any other additions there or corrections.
Sure, yes, thank you, Peter. Yeah, so the app is up on GitHub. Anybody is welcome to contribute. Peter says is correct, into developing a JSON, GeoJSON equivalent for the ISO 19115-2 and now the 19115-3 standard is actually in the works right now. And there's a reader, or actually a writer, that'll write that out to XML as well for groups that need the XML. And then the group right now, there's a lead, one of the lead developers is developing an interface for users to be able to enter their metadata, it's a metadata entry form that can be a standalone application running off a web browser, or they can install it locally. And so there's actually interest in getting feedback on that tool. If anybody's interested, they're welcome to contact me after the call. But yeah, it's been a couple-year project in the works. I mean, the Adiway group initially was formed in 2009. We started working with the ISO in 2011. And I do think there's been a lot of good work done there that would be great to look towards, and for people to pick up the parts maybe that make sense. It's a good community implementation. I think it's worth looking through the documentation, maybe trying some of the tools. And if anyone's interested in contributing, we'd welcome participation in work group sessions.
Great, thanks for the question.
I put a link in the chat.
Great, thanks.
Yeah,
sorry.
Sorry, Peter, this is Sarah. I just wanted to say that this was also the Terrestrial Ecosystems Collaboration Team, and who interacted a lot with Adiway on this. A couple great presentations by Stan Smith explaining all the work that was done by Adiway, and I'll put a link in the meeting notes and on the webpage so people can find that.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's Stan
and I would suggest, yeah, exactly. I think it would be great if it'd be possible for them to present remotely or provide some slides just to provide some information about the effort during the Rome meeting.
Yes, so I'm going to be reaching out, Bill, very soon and sort of coordinating, and so I'd like, yours and Allison's advice on what kind of content we should be providing internationally.
We'd be happy to contribute.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, I am going to actually call on Colleen Strawhacker because I would like just a few thoughts on the challenges to interoperabilities and opportunities related to social science data for the Arctic.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So I've been thinking a lot as we've been talking over the past hour, and it seems like a lot of these issues have to do with capacity, both in terms of being able to have the money to do a lot of these things and also skill sets and having access to people who know how to do a lot of these things. Social science data is especially kind of pertinent to this because we have a lot less money in the social sciences, first of all. We work often with communities who don't have the capacity to do a lot of these things as well. Social science data can be really complicated to work with when you're talking about privacy issues, confidentiality issues, lots of differing formats and things like that. And that's not really specific to the social sciences for sure, but a lot of social scientists are just using, our qualitative data, quantitative data across the board. So I think a lot of this comes down to issues of capacity, both skill set-wise, financially. We talk about that a lot in social science data management issues, and it hits on a lot of the questions that you have up on your PowerPoint right now too, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. We are coming on time, but we have a few minutes left. So any other thoughts or comments or things that you'd really like to add to the record? Knowing, of course, you can certainly email us if you have other thoughts after the fact.
Hey, this is Lynn. If I could just throw in one more comment at the end. You had mentioned earlier, what are the potential connection points to global work and global knowledge, global resources, maybe infrastructure? I think there's some really interesting questions there. Some of the topics that we've talked about today even aren't necessarily Arctic specific, especially in terms of working with scientists to set up interoperability from the start of data collection or planning. Some of the technical questions, ideally connections with social science as well. These are all questions that the global data community is struggling with as well. So I'm wondering where some of the mutual benefit connection points are. I mean, it's always difficult to add more connections, but I think there could be some pros as well. So I'm just interested in the conversation moving forward in terms of global connections with Arctic and polar work. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. So very specifically with respect to the Frascati Row meeting, as you know, Mark Parsons, the Executive Director of Research Data Alliance, will be there, and he'll be doing a keynote on that topic. We're also going to have a number of people from the Geo Initiative and WMO sort of connecting to the conversation, because I think you bring up a really important point, and having just returned not that long ago from the last Research Data Alliance meeting, there's much in the way of crossover. All of these are being discussed at a global level. So that's not to say we don't have polar and Arctic issues that we need to look at as a community, but I think we can gain a lot from those conversations. But it was also very clear at that meeting in Denver last month that we can contribute a lot. We're doing some things that much of the rest of the world are not doing in terms of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary work, in terms of working not only with the science community, but with indigenous communities in the Arctic and so on. So I think there are lots of good connections possible there, but as you said, it'll take some effort to really tease those out, and that's something, though, that I think would be definitely worthwhile. Okay, with that, I may wrap up the meeting, or at least the conversation. If you have any other thoughts, you can go and add comments to the IARPIC collaborations site in relation to this event, or find us by email, through the IARPIC site, etc. And feel free to send any ideas at any time. The process that's going to start with the workshop in Frascati will actually go on at least until late year and into the early new year. And we're looking at then wrapping up our report and getting it to our sponsors early in 2017. So if you do have any thoughts and ideas, please pass them along.